Andrew Sheldon is the Godly Play advocate for international development, and I think that's probably, for godly players, the thing that's most important. And I met Andrew probably in 2014, kind of in passing. We didn't know who this person was who'd come from Canada. And then in 2019, I had the privilege of going to Newfoundland to the North American Godly Play Conference, because it sounded like it would be a bit of a laugh and a blast, and it was. And I sat listening to Andrew doing the talk that he's going to do tonight and thinking, oh yeah, that's what I want to do. The pandemic kind of got in the way a little bit, but hearing Andrew talk about sitting with 500 children a month doing Godly Play. It was a month, it wasn't just a week.
Yes, a month.
Yes, a month. And I thought, that's really what I would love to do. That would be just wonderful. I must retire and do that. But then the pandemic got in the way, so maybe one of these days. But yeah. And he's also said, I'll come and speak to the people in Scotland. And I thought, such a long way from Canada. How can I really ask him to come from Canada? But as I got to know him over the years, what I've discovered is that next to Godly Play, the thing he likes best, apart from his wife, is, who's also a Godly Play trainer, is travelling. Yeah. The pandemic was hard when you couldn't travel.
Yeah, it was awful.
So asking him to come to Scotland just wasn't really a hardship, I don't think. So thank you very much for joining us. And I guess, are you ready?
I'm ready.
Yeah, you've got the nice mic that you don't have to hold on to really hard. So thank you. I will give this to you.
And it's great to be in Scotland. Yes, I do like to travel, and Godly Play has given me that opportunity, and I think it's 30 countries now that I visited for Godly Play. And that isn't all the countries that has Godly Play. Right now, we're in around 50 countries, Godly Play. So, and after this, I get to visit a new country for me, which is Estonia. On one day, neighbors of our friends here from Latvia, where I've been. And it's wonderful to be here with Erica from Ukraine. And we did a core training, the first core training in Ukraine just 5 months before the war started. So they have been in my thoughts a lot. It's wonderful to see you. And to be here in Edinburgh, beautiful, beautiful city. We were here once. As Alex said, my wife Amy is a Godly Play trainer. She's the one that brought me into Godly Play. Amy was trained by Jerome Berryman in the mid-1990s. And I first heard her telling a story, and I fell in love with Godly Play, and as it turned out, I fell in love with her. So, and the rest is history. So, are you ready is the theme. And it's a drag getting old, isn't it? your eyesight goes. Now, perfect. Good, I can see it there. Just for those of you who like text messaging, so the threshold. Thresholds are really important in Godly Play. Of course, when we talk about a Godly Play space, we talk about the threshold, that place where children are outside and then they're inside. And it is at the threshold, actually, where we ask that question, isn't it? Are you ready? And there's a poem that I was introduced to some years ago, and I don't know if the poem is... Should check these things, of course. Yeah. It's by Anne Lewin. And she wrote, "Pause at the threshold of the sacred space. Bow low." I wonder if we should start doing that when we enter a godly playroom. "Prepare for fresh encounter with the Holy One." And it's that notion of pause that I'm compelled by. That there are thresholds that is important for us to pause at before we cross into. Now, that's what we do. That's what we invite children to do at the threshold of godly play, isn't it? I mean, we do want them to pause. I mean, the thing that we need to remind ourselves constantly as godly players is, are you ready is a genuine question. We only ask genuine questions in godly play. In so many other aspects of their lives, children are actually asked disingenuous questions because the adult really doesn't, has something in mind. But these are all, we always ask genuine questions. Wondering questions are, and so is, are you ready? And so they can't help but pause, right? We can't help but pause when we're asked, are you ready? Because we have to think about it. Am I ready? So what I want to suggest and to talk about tonight is that there are other thresholds where we need to pause, and we need to contemplate, and we need to ask the question, am I ready? And I'm going to suggest that there are at least 4 of these thresholds, 4 places of readiness, places where we ask the question, are you ready? And places where readiness is actually very important before we cross the threshold. So I'm going back, before we even get to the room, right to the root of our practice of godly play, to say, there are 4 thresholds we need to cross before we can imagine doing godly play. And we need to pause and ask ourselves the question, am I ready? So what are these places of readiness? Well, first of all, there they are. 4 ways of being ready to be a godly play mentor or guide. The first is to be theologically ready. Now, Jerome Berryman has based godly play on some very deep theological notions. And it's important for godly play practitioners to know them and to have a level of comfort with them, especially if at some point you want to challenge them. You might as well know about what you're challenging. I was with Jerome just 10 days ago for 2 or 3 days. Amy and I visited with him. And we went, as is often the case, to the Center for the Theology of Childhood, which is 3 rooms where he has an office, but also a library. And there must be 1,500 books in that library. And he's read every one of them, more than once. And he was looking for a particular book. We all had to go searching for this book that he was looking for to work with again. And these books helped form what for Jerome is the deep theology on which godly play is based. And the book that he was looking for, interestingly enough, just 10 days ago, was a book by Meister Eckhart. Have you heard of Meister Eckhart? He was one of those who was a proponent of something that we call negative theology. And in a nutshell, and I don't have time. I have to be careful always because I can go on and on, but to get deeply into it. But negative theology is essentially saying that there's no language that can adequately apply to God. That any human language that we use to apply to God is, in some sense, limited. Now, I don't know how many of you were at the trainer gathering in the Netherlands a few years ago. Do you remember Rico Sneller, one of the speakers? He talked about this very thing. And he introduced us to somebody named Maimonides, right? And this 12th century rabbi or philosopher wrote, among other things, a book called A Guide for the Perplexed. And what he was struggling with was this idea of anthropomorphism, which simply is that is the tendency to attribute human attributes to the divine, and determine that our words about God never fully apply to God, and that God's essence and nature is actually unknowable, which is what that idea of negative theology is getting at. As such, any language about God in the Bible applies to God's actions, or even more importantly, on how God is experienced. So even though the language, and forgive me if this gets too deep, but even though if the language is about God, it's actually more often than not about us. In other words, our experience of God. It references God, but it's saying something about us. And we know about this in Godly Play. God came so close to Abram, and Abram felt so close to God that he knew what to do, right? God came so close to Moses. Moses felt so close to God that he knew what to do. So God is experienced in our experience and in our actions. And, you know, I'm not going to go on and on about that. But in other words, we need to hold lightly those claims we make about God, and always recognize that those claims may be the best we can attempt. They may still fall far short. And so the best way to talk about God is to tell a story of God's actions and human response, and then wonder about it. I mean, that's what Meister Eckhart is kind of getting at. Maimonides is getting at. Jacques Derrida, a French philosopher, he once wrote that once you start talking about God, you should be interrupted by another. And I love that line. So, you know, those of us that worry about class management, it's okay if the children are interrupting us. That needs to be what happens when we talk about God, which is very different than, I mean, think of the sermon we were talking about preaching earlier, but it's usually not common practice to be interrupted while you're preaching, right? But maybe it should be. And maybe we can talk more about that tomorrow when we talk about the Godly Play congregation. But this is what these people are encouraging. So what might all this mean for Godly Play is the question. In the first place, Jerome was heavily influenced by a book by Samuel Therien called The Elusive Presence. The title says it all, right? And this is the reason, my friends, this is the reason why in Godly Play we don't celebrate Christmas and Easter and Pentecost. What do we celebrate? The mystery of Christmas, the mystery of Easter, the mystery of Pentecost. God's elusive presence. So Jerome wrote, the primary theme used in Godly Play to tie together the narrative of Scripture is that of God's people searching for the elusive presence of the mystery of God. And Jerome has contended that every curriculum has a theme that is followed, and for Godly Play, it is explicitly the theme as set out in Therien's book, that God is an elusive presence. And so keeping in mind this idea of negative theology and how it is that we can make claims about God, Jerome wrote, by presenting the larger narrative as one where people are seeking the mystery of God's presence, children are given permission to express what they have already experienced with an appropriate language. They are given permission to express what they have already experienced with an appropriate language. That's exactly in all that deep stuff, which, you know, Maimonides, Meister Eckhart, all these other people that are proponents of negative theology are saying. Now, obviously, there's a counter to that. And that counter would be what Jerome might have in mind when, in one of his books, The Spiritual Guidance of Children, he talks about, you know, that typology of Godly Play, ideal Godly Play, good enough Godly Play, and anti-Godly Play. So anti-Godly Play, negative theology, if you like, anti-elusive presence, anti the mystery of Christmas, is a way of talking about God that makes absolute claims based on some kind of notion that Scripture is an inerrant, divinely communicated revelation from God that is not open to discussion. So, if you believe that, and many Christians do, and I'm not here to argue that, if you believe that, you're really going to have a hard time doing godly play. If Scripture is inerrant and divinely communicated revelation that's not open to discussion. We believe otherwise. And so summing up, Aquinas, Maimonides, Derrida, Terrian, and Berryman, if you are going to make claims about God and give language to those claims, then the best way to do that is by telling stories of the human experience of God's action and then exercising the imagination in order to make meaning. That is godly play. And to be ready, to be theologically ready to do godly play, you need to understand and embrace that. So, are you ready? Are you theologically ready? And I skipped a bunch of, I love that quote. There it is, Samuel Terrian's book, The Elusive Presence. I think it's one of those things that godly players should probably read. Sorry, I should have been doing all this. Are there any questions or comments about being theologically ready? We can talk at the end, too, if something comes up for you. So the second readiness is to be spiritually ready. In Teaching Godly Play, the book Teaching Godly Play, Jerome asked the question, how will you know godly play when you see it? And suggests that 3 questions be asked. The first is the possibility left wide open for God to come and play? The second is the community of children at play? And these questions, and the third question is the spiral curriculum at work, but that's another topic. But is there room for God to play, and are the children at play? And I think they get at the heart of what it means to be spiritually ready to do godly play. And so the first question about allowing for God's presence, is the possibility left wide open for God to come and play, is a question of trust. Now, Rebecca Nye, who you probably all know in her book on children's spirituality, What It Is and Why It Matters, writes of the need to trust God in order for children's spirits to be nurtured. That's the T in spirit, right? Her acronym. Ironically, most Christian education methods and materials and curriculums do not allow for the presence of God. Now, I realize it's an outrageous thing to say, and I would never suggest that that's the purpose of the people that create these curriculums or the teachers that teach them, But actually, if you step back and think about it, that's kind of what happens. There's not actually room for God to play. And when you have a mandated lesson outcome, when you have a trajectory of the session towards a particular meaning that the children can articulate, then where's the room to play? It's just really not there. I know, like I said, I don't believe that's the intention, but I actually think that's the result. And so in godly play, the bias is to assume that God may be present, which is what Jerome says, that God may be present. I like the use of the word may be, and it recognizes that if the process is going to be open, it has to be truly open, even for God, to choose. And so the particular spiritual discipline for the godly play mentor is trust, to let go, to trust God enough to get out of the way and leave the space open for God and the children to play. Play is voluntary. It's done for its own sake. It's not to be confused with activity, which is organized and directed. No, that's not to say that godly play is not organized. But it is organized in such a way that the possibility for play is enhanced. There's a lot of ironies in godly play. Organized in such a way that the possibility for play is enhanced. This is trust. This is letting go. This is getting out of the way. And this, I believe, is actually a spiritual discipline. And it's a discipline because it's not easy. It defies our natural instincts, and like many spiritual disciplines, it will require time and commitment. And this practice, this spiritual practice, this spiritual discipline of getting out of the way, of trusting, is what Jerome calls tranquility in his book, Teaching Godly Play. To be tranquil is to be free of disturbance. Free of disturbance in order to contemplate. This practice of contemplation, in order to know tranquility, has many expressions in godly play. Some really practical ones, like being in the room before the session begins. Long before the session begins. The opposite of tranquility is busyness. And so flying into the room at the last minute only to discover that parts of your story are missing, and if they are, by the way, look in the desert. That's not tranquility. Achieving tranquility is also about knowing the story well enough that any anxiety about getting it right has receded. So that discipline, the discipline of learning the story by heart, is a spiritual discipline. I think sometimes people think it's just a way it's something we do to make their lives difficult. No, it nurtures the possibility of nurturing spirits. Tranquility is about entering the space, ensuring the environment is in place, contemplating about what is about to happen. And even during the full session itself, the Godly Play Guide can achieve tranquility simply by adhering to the method. And here's another one of those ironies that I love to repeat very often at core training or trainer training, and that is that the tranquility to be found in godly play, the freedom to be found in godly play, is by rigidly adhering to the method. Right? It just seems odd to even say it. But the tranquility, the freedom to be found, is by rigidly adhering to the method. And again, sometimes people want to push back against that, right? Like, why do we have to look down at the story? Why do we have to learn the story by heart? Why do we have to do things in this order? And this is what it's about. It's about tranquility. It's about that spiritual discipline. And so it's trust. It's trust. And that's a spiritual discipline because we want to control. We want to take charge. Trust the process. Trust the story to tell itself. Trust the children to find meaning and language through wondering. Trust God to come and play. Like the light that is still with us after it has been changed. We can experience the session long after it is over. So, I actually think one of the reasons, one of the phenomenon that part of my story is I first encountered godly play, and I first embraced godly play as a parish priest. I thought there's something here. I think, and like most parish priests, what I'm interested in is vitality and growth, right? And I thought that there's something here. And I think one of the things that I have seen that is very compelling to a pastor, to a priest, is that godly play practitioners, they hang in. Like, I remember when I'd have to recruit people every year to do Sunday school. And then we started doing godly play, and they just kept coming back. And I think part of it was because it was mentoring them spiritually. They were spiritually nurtured by doing godly play. Oh, I keep forgetting about this slideshow, don't I? There you go, tranquility. Brenda Timmer is a Godly Play South Africa trainer. She also is quite involved in Ignatian sort of spiritual practice. And she did a workshop on, some of you may have experienced it, sort of a conversation between Jerome and Ignatius that she imagined. But in that she says, the spirituality nurtured by godly play is for life. As with Ignatian spiritual direction, godly play recognizes that anyone we accompany has a pre-existing relationship with God and will continue in relationship with God long after we are no longer part of that person's story. We do not seek to create spiritual highs or achieve religious goals. As the Creator deals with the creature, adults in the godly playroom gently support the child. And to gently support the child is to be fully in the moment. That is a spiritual discipline that godly play guides must nurture. And as I said, it's not easy, which is why it's a spiritual discipline. And finally, there is a bonus on being spiritually present to the children. It's good for you. Many years ago, Jerome wrote an essay on theologizing with children. And in it, he writes, theologizing with children is conceived of as a spiritual practice for the mutual benefit of both the children and adults involved. The benefit for adults is that being in touch with children benefits their spiritual maturity, as Jesus observed, right? Unless you become like a child. The benefit for the children is that when adults understand better about becoming like a child, they are better able to mentor children, which in turn helps the children to be more fully themselves, which in turn makes them better mentors to the adults. So, are you spiritually ready? We pause at that threshold and ask that question. Next, and by the way, this is in no particular order. This is not a chronology of value here. I can't read that from here. What does it say?
Live in the moment, just not this moment, some other moment, the moment.
Yeah, right. Okay. But it's this moment that you have to be a part of. So, are you spiritually ready? Emotional readiness. Emotional readiness is the capacity to be aware of, to control and express one's emotions, and to handle interpersonal relationships judiciously and empathetically. Now, I don't know if you have heard of something called family systems theory. And this picture is actually interesting because family systems theory was initially a concept first conceived of by an American psychologist, family psychologist called Murray Bowen. And what Murray Bowen recognized, he was a child psychologist actually. And so parents would send children to him for him to fix, right? My child is a problem. What can you do? And what he realized was that the child was not this independent being, but was part of a system. In this case, part of a family. And so he began the practice of not just working with the child, but working with the family, bringing the parents in as well. And if it was a marriage issue, not just working with an individual, but bringing the couple together. And then family systems theory was adapted for use by religious leaders by a rabbi named Edwin Friedman. And so a system is defined as any group of living beings in regular contact with one another and which operate under similar principles, we're either conscious of that or not. So, a family is a system. A workplace is a system. A congregation is a system. I teach pastoral theology at the seminary in Toronto, and I always talk about family system theory because congregations are systems. And for the purpose of tonight, a godly play circle is a system. And what I want to mostly focus on, because this is a very big topic and a very big field, is the behavior of the leader within a system. And Edwin Friedman writes a lot about this. He has a book called From Generation to Generation, which I think every clergy person should read. And what he focuses on in terms of the leader within a system is the leader being a non-anxious presence. Because systems can become anxious. Godly play circles can become anxious, just like families can be, workplaces can be, congregations can be. And the key is that the leader be a non-anxious presence. And the operative term here is presence. Doesn't mean you won't be anxious. Trust me, I'm a pastor. I've experienced lots of anxiety in the context of a congregation. But it's important for me to be a non-anxious presence. To do this, according to Friedman, one must be self-differentiated. To be self-differentiated is define the self while staying in touch with others. So, one way I think Friedman talks about it is you're connected, but you're not fused. Right? So, to be in touch with others, but to be self-aware, knowing what you know and what you don't know, to know what you are responsible for and what you are not responsible for, to be true to your principles and practices and not be swayed by the negative behavior of others, to be a non-anxious presence. Now, this has implications for godly play guides. If you are spiritually ready, then you are more likely to convey a non-anxious presence. If you know and adhere to the godly play method, you will know your role as a storyteller or door person and not feel the need to intrude on the other. That's why in godly play core training, one of the key learnings that we want to communicate is the difference in the roles and the responsibilities. Some of you have been trained by me or by me and Amy. You know that little practice where you have the storyteller and the door person, you got all those little slips of paper, and people put the pieces of paper under the right one. That's always a great learning where people realize, yeah, these are two different roles with different responsibilities. So if you know, then you're self-differentiated. There's no hierarchy amongst the adults, just different roles and responsibilities. I hope you know that. It's so easy, I think, in godly play to say, well, the storyteller, and then the door person. One of the interesting things about this exercise that we do is the number of responsibilities for the door person is actually more than for the storyteller. So, this is also true of the relationship with children. The adults and the children in the room also have different roles and responsibilities. What's one of our unspoken lessons in godly play? We do not do for children what they can do for themselves. And don't anticipate a child's needs that they don't articulate for themselves. So it's also true in the relationship between the adult and the adult in the room, but also between the adult and the children. We don't do for children what they can do for themselves. We don't anticipate what a child's needs might be if they can't or don't articulate them. We need to know where we end and they begin. I once was a storyteller, and I had a door person who during work time actually called across the room to a child and said, "I think I know what you are trying to do." Would you like me to help you? And the child said, no, thank you. In this case, the child was self-differentiated and the door person wasn't. Know your role. So if you submit to the principles and practices inherent in godly play, inherent in the godly play method, you will remain true to those principles and practices and not let the negative behavior of others cause you to change your behavior in order to bring harmony. If you are self-differentiated, then you will not take disruptions personally and will take steps that are in the best interest of the child, of the circle, rather than the best interest of your need to control. And this is something that Friedman is all over. And, I'm sure there are other clergy in the room, and he can be very critical of the clergy's need for harmony. Everything to be nice. And very often that can only occur at the expense of, your true principles and practices. And what really matters in a congregation. So think of that in the context of the circle. There are ways that we can probably achieve harmony that we want, but they would not be the godly play ways. So if you're self-differentiated, you don't take disruptions personally, and you do take steps that are in the best interest of the circle, rather than in the best interest of your need to control. So for godly play to work, it needs non-anxious, self-differentiated adult guides to guide the process. This is more the case than the add water and mix forms of religious education where you simply, doggedly sometimes, follow the lesson plan. Godly play mentors need to be nimble. They need to be confident in themselves and confident in the process. They need to be emotionally mature and self-differentiated. They need to know where they begin and the other adult ends, where they end and where the children begin. And that is to be emotionally ready. Sometimes there may not be a story, and that's okay. I mean, if you think of the kind of curriculums that many of us sort of grew up with, that wasn't okay, right? You have a lesson outcome. You have to finish it, which is why I said sometimes doggedly, you try to make that happen. Sometimes there's not a story. Sometimes the children just don't get ready. Amy will often tell a story about, at one of my churches, a couple of churches ago, where it was the Sunday before Christmas. I think Christmas was like a day or two away. Those children were never going to be ready, right? They were going through the roof. So today we're just going to have work time. Or today, let's just have a feast. That's part of being emotionally ready to do godly play, not to say, yeah. So, are you ready? Are you emotionally ready? So, theologically ready, spiritually ready, emotionally ready, and finally, number 4 is pedagogical readiness. So, what is being pedagogically ready? Well, first of all, it's about much more than having attended a core training and having a working knowledge of the godly play method. It's a great start, but it's just a start. As has been noted, and probably noted to you repeatedly, godly play is different than most other forms of faith formation or spiritual nurture of children, most other forms of Christian education. And what makes it different is that it operates according to a particular set of pedagogical principles, and that these pedagogical differences actually challenge and subvert many of the received approaches to the spiritual nurture and faith formation of children. Actually, I think one of the differences is that godly play actually attends to the spiritual nurture of children and not just their Christian education. And, you know, I think one of the ways that I've seen Godly Play evolve in a positive way in terms of what we think pedagogically is our language. Now, originally, if you go back to the beginning of Godly Play, Jerome did talk about and write about the classroom, the lesson, the teacher. But what I've seen, and I think it's a positive development, is over time, we've kind of moved away from that language. So it's not a classroom, it's the Godly Playroom. It's not a lesson, it's a story. It's not a teacher, but there's different language we might use, guide or mentor of the children. And I think that language is actually a good one. But what do we mean by pedagogy? Okay. So simply defined, pedagogy is the method and practice of teaching. So I just said we don't say teacher, but we do teach. To be clear, and despite what some might think, in Godly Play, we are teaching. And learning is taking place. I think some of the people that critique Godly Play, and there are people that critique Godly Play, they seem to have this, that's not what we're doing. That we're not teaching. The children aren't learning anything. They couldn't possibly learn this way. But we are teaching and children are learning. What is different is how the learning takes place. That's different. Not that learning doesn't take place, but how the learning takes place. And this is what I mean about being pedagogically ready. We need to know how Godly Play teaches and how learning takes place. We know the methods and the practices. We know how to lead a full session, but do we know the pedagogical principles that undergird the methods and practices? Now, we did already imply a lot of this when we talked about theological readiness. But let's look at it more from a pedagogical perspective. In articulating the Godly Play pedagogy, Jerome does so by comparing it to a more common pedagogy he calls the transfer method. Okay, so the transfer method is what Jerome calls it. The transfer model of education concentrates on concepts moving from the teacher to the student. The concepts arise from the experience and the knowledge of the teacher, or of the compiler of the curriculum, which are also developed from the experience of others whose teaching informs the curriculum. But where Godly Play differentiates is to who is doing the conceptualizing from experience. So in the transfer model, it is the compiler of the curriculum, or the teacher, who is conceptualizing from experience, or from their own learning, in other words, the experience of someone else. Godly Play invites the children to generate meaning from the interplay of their own experience and the story. So the child makes meaning. This is really important. I don't know about you, but maybe I'm an outlier, but I don't think I am, actually. I actually resist other people trying to make meaning for me. That was my problem as a child, I think. I couldn't articulate it. I just knew I had a problem. Some people thought I just had a problem with authority. I'm not sure that was it entirely. I think it was someone else trying to make meaning for me. And the beauty of Godly Play is we invite the children to make meaning. Now, let me step back and say, this is not to say that the transfer model is not without merit. Perhaps if I want my child to learn math or physics, the transfer model may be what I would want. Although, there is something called discovery mathematics. Do you have that? Have you heard of that? It's a big debate where I come from about whether discovery mathematics works or not. But anyway, I think I have a slide on that. I just realized I'm looking, oh, there we go, discovery learning. Yes. Now, I don't have any opinion about mathematics, as I was saying to Alex's son, who's a mathematician. The last time I took math was grade 10 and I failed. But I am compelled by the fact that contemporary pedagogies of education include principles used in godly play, that there are people in that field who are actually thinking about this discovery method as opposed to just pure transfer method. It would suggest that what we do isn't actually so fanciful after all. So again, in godly play, rather than having an adult be the delivery system on how and what is to be taught, the children are invited to make a journey of discovery to find meaning. Children are not merely instructed to memorize concepts that others have arrived at. They are invited to participate in their own learning. And they do learn. You know this, don't you? I can think of two stories. One was many years ago, the children and youth person at my church, I had, when we hired her, we said, we do godly play. You need to be trained in godly play. And so she came to a godly play core training, which was actually in the context of a course that I was teaching at the seminary. And at one point, of course, as people do, they were sort of challenging this notion. Well, how did, if you're not telling the children what the story means, how can they possibly learn anything? How can they possibly arrive at the conclusion that they need to arrive at, And Lindsay told us the story that when she came to our church, she inherited two groups of children. And the one group of children who are now sort of in their mid-teens, so they weren't children, but mid-teens, they had never done godly play. She inherited another group of children that were sort of young adolescents who'd been doing godly play for about 5 or 6 years. And she was able to articulate, I realize this is anecdotal and not empirical, but she was able to articulate the difference between those two groups. How that younger group who had done godly play were more biblically literate, theologically articulate, comfortable with things like prayer, and talking about their own faith, their own experience. The other story I tell is, as Alex mentioned, I do have the opportunity often to tell stories to about 400 children a month, because at the church where I have an office and do some part-time work, there's an independent day school that's attached. And godly play is what we use for the religious education of those children in chapel. And also the younger children come to the godly play room. And at the end of the year, last year, or maybe it was pre-pandemic, I don't know. We all lost track, didn't we? But the very last chapel, I asked them, I wonder, what godly play story this past year you liked the best? What story you liked the best? I wonder what story was the most important. I wonder if any stories we could have left out, we still had all we need. And I wonder where you were in the story. And they just talked. They just wondered. They remembered the stories. They were putting the pieces together. One of my favorite was a little girl who just, kept going like this. And I think it was, where were you in the story? And she finally, I sort of looked at her and she said, only the women had the courage to go to the tomb. She had remembered that. And this was a few months later, right? So they learn. To some, this discovery approach seems out of control. How can we be sure that children will learn what they're supposed to think and feel about the Christian faith? And again, godly play does not reject the notion that there is content to the Christian faith. Jerome is quite explicit. As with Rebecca, who articulates this really well, children have an innate experience of God. He affirms that is exactly the case. But we are teaching them a language system so that it's not just that they know God, but they can talk about God. And so, godly play, we believe that there's content to the faith, and we want children to access and know these orthodox concepts that are central to our faith and have stood the test of time. It's all about how they get there. It's how they get there. And there's plenty of evidence. I've just told you a couple of stories throughout the Godly Play community that in Godly Play, children are learning what we desire them to learn. And don't be afraid either. Sometimes in Godly Play, I feel like we're even afraid to say that. We do desire that the children learn some things. Of course we do. And that's okay. Again, it's how they get there. So, on the one hand, as mentioned earlier, Godly Play trusts that God is present in the process. It trusts that the linked Christian language system can speak for themselves in such a way that children grasp their eternal meaning. And Jerome wrote, in Godly Play, doctrine is sustained because the children find it to be true through their play. So doctrine is sustained. Orthodoxy, dare I use it, although I know there's a whole lot of different orthodoxies, but is sustained because the children find it to be true through their play. And that's why Jerome calls Godly Play playful orthodoxy. And he writes, playful orthodoxy encourages children to be both deeply rooted in the classical system and at the same time open to new people, new ideas, new situations, and new ways of thinking without being uprooted. That's a really powerful quote about how children learn. Playful orthodoxy encourages children to be both deeply rooted in the classical system, but at the same time open to new people, new ideas, new situations, and new ways of thinking without being uprooted. And so, and again, we have a pedagogy built on trust. You see how these sort of undergird one another if we're ready in all these ways. The transfer method only trusts the knowledge and experience of the expert, and the teacher is simply a delivery agent. In Godly Play, we trust God, we trust the tradition, we trust the child, and we trust ourselves as a facilitating agent. So are you pedagogically ready? Thresholds are very important in Godly Play. This is why it is important for the adult guides to have already crossed the threshold long before the children arrive. Pause at the threshold of the sacred space. Bow low. Prepare for fresh encounter with the Holy One. As I said, I'm compelled by the notion of pausing at the threshold. And what I have suggested is that there are thresholds that is important to cross, even before we cross the threshold into a Godly Play space. Thresholds where we pause and contemplate before we move on. Thresholds where we ask the question, am I ready? Amen. So, questions, comments, concerns, challenges. Oh, yes.
Hold it there, please, and not these tiny. That's a roving mic.
I was going to say
Any-
that this
right.
either means that you fully comprehended it or you don't have a clue what I just said.
I'll work that way around, yes. Is that okay? Yes.
I'm really conscious of male voices and stuff that I'm speaking as a man and you're a man and it's all getting quite now, but
Yeah.
putting that one aside, I was wondering about Godly Play in maybe black cultures or working class cultures, because my experience of Godly Play has been that it's been in quite middle class churches, and I know my experience is really limited. I'm not saying that's, and also And I suppose I'm thinking particularly of black churches where there's a different spirituality in terms of the minister's experience or the person preaching's experience of the world around them being a really big part of the story, and they're preaching from that experience, and the congregation responds with sort of, amen, we've felt that too, we know that too. And how you, in terms of pedagogy, you bring yourself as a storyteller. I mean, maybe, and particularly in contexts where it's more working class, there's other issues around where it feels more pertinent that, because I think the white male voice is quite, anyway, so I'm quite happy to leave that at the door a bit, but if you're a black storyteller and there's black kids in the room, or you're a working class storyteller, is it different then because you need to bring something more of your own experience and validate that for the kids? Pedagogically, is it different? Oh, sorry, that's an abstract question, but it was what was in my head.
I mean, there's a few things I can do with it. Number one, be yourself, I mean, that's part of what it is to be self-differentiated. I think I would say that the integrity of the philosophy, if you like, holds everywhere. But there's also the issue of context. So I can tell you that you're correct. I think that godly play in its origins and in some pockets of the godly play world is still very much to be found in sort of middle class churches. But it is not, and that's a challenge. I know, for instance, in the United States, it's a particular challenge to sort of break out of that, and efforts are being made. But I can also tell you that godly play is taking place in churches and in cultures where people are different colors. They're not white. I mean, godly play is alive and well in Africa, in Ethiopia, in Zimbabwe, in South Africa. Godly play stories have been translated into those languages, and I have been in contexts where godly play is quite active in very working class, poor areas. So I think there's two things that happen. I've written about this, about when you contextualizing godly play. And I think on the one hand, there's listening to the culture and adapting where it's appropriate. So I think you're talking about that. And I can only leave that up to you to do that, to listen to the culture and adapt where appropriate. But I think the other thing that does happen in godly play is we also challenge the culture. Remember I said earlier, godly play does subvert, it does challenge. And there are some cultures more than others. In Canada, part of what I just said about, the value of the child and the child making meaning for themselves and the child forming identity for themselves and wondering, that's not all that subversive or crazy, The culture kind of says, oh yeah, I mean, children have been more highly valued than in the past. I mean, when I was a child, you were seen but not heard, Children in some cultures are now heard, but in others, no. So I've traveled the world, as you know, and I've been in cultures where people have said to me, man, this isn't going to work in our culture. I mean, our church, we tell the children what the story means. They don't, that's what we do. And so that's what I would say to them. Okay, you need to listen to your culture and adapt where appropriate, but you also need to challenge them. Because when Jesus said, unless you become like a child, when Jesus took a little child into his arms, Jesus wasn't just taking little white children into his arms and saying they're of value. He was saying every child is of value. And sometimes we have to challenge that in godly play. So I don't know if any of that makes any sense.
That's really helpful.
Yeah, okay.
Thank you very much for that. Just one observation which really rang a bell and then a question. First of all, I really liked what you said about finding freedom through a rigid adherence to the material. I think that's fantastic. My background is as a liturgist, and in my work as a priest, as a liturgical educator, and working within churches which have a very broad worshipping tradition, where some people sit quite lightly to liturgical material, structure, form, and sacramental action. Found that actually very helpful, because it is, for me at any rate, it is by participating in those things that actually the freedom comes, and there is room therefore for God to be present. So wonderful to hear that said. The other is a question. The context in which Heather and I work is in the Western Isles, where it's the highest level of church going in the UK, and most of it within extremely conservative Presbyterian circles. Think Church of Scotland 60 years ago, and reactions of a more conservative nature against that, and you've probably just about got to where you are. And I just wonder whether you could offer any reflection on experience of godly play as a method of formation in a culture where the majority of people do not have a sacramental worldview.
So by a sacramental worldview,
the idea that objects, stories have a meaning beyond themselves. That there isn't a givenness about scripture, for instance, and that that isn't just a candle that's on there.
Right.
It has the potential to be something else and to mean something else.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's efficacious, right?
Indeed.
That's a fancy word.
Yeah.
It's a challenge. I don't know what to say more than that. It's a challenge in those contexts, because that is what godly play is. It is very sacramental, and those traditions that you're talking about are ones that their pedagogy, if you like, is very much about that transfer method, like delivering information. I had a student who once wrote an essay in the course. I teach a course, and I embed a godly play core training in the course, which is really neat in my context, because our university education is state subsidized. And so that means that the state is actually subsidizing people to learn how to do godly play, which I think is kind of cool. But this person in the essay they wrote suggested that godly play was an antidote, almost like a vaccine against fundamentalism. So on the one hand, I would say it's a challenge. On the other hand, it could be a gift. Godly play could be like almost like an underground way of pushing people away from that worldview and that way of being. So I think what I would say to people who find themselves in that context is persevere. It's the way that we try to get, excuse my language, for defense, I'm sorry, but the way that we try to get fundamentalists away from being fundamentalists is often by using fundamentalist approaches. So we try to argue them into thinking differently. Well, that's not going to work. But I think getting on the floor and telling a story and inviting them to wonder, that might be an effective way of. So a challenge, yes, but perhaps also a gift.
If I can just add to that and make a couple of reflections. Look, we're husband and wife, we work together. So with our we have some storytellers who are from that stable. And that cashes out even in simple ways, like how a storyteller will handle the materials, because to them they aren't sacramental in any way, they are just objects, things, and it's trying to get that idea across. And also just a reflection from the other side, that from time to time in our godly play circle we have families from these different church stables. And I asked the question in one story, I wonder if there's any part of this story we could leave out and still have all the story we need. And this mother, it was an all-age group, jumped straight at me and said, absolutely not. She said, every single word in the Bible is the word of God, and it would be absolutely sacrilege to leave any word out, you know. And she went, oh, no. So that's the kind of context.
But if she's saying that about a Godly Play story, I sometimes confess to being a Godly Play fundamentalist. Like, I don't want people messing at all with it, you know. So. And the liturgy piece, I like that. A full session is, you know, I think of it, I mean, Dom Gregory Dix, do you remember the book, The Shape of the Liturgy? I think that's what a full session is. It's a liturgy. And I think the reason that, for those of us who are liturgically minded, and I get that not everybody is, we believe that kind of adhering to the liturgy is actually a way of facilitating an encounter with God that can happen. And that is what we're hoping for in Godly Play as well. Very much so.
I've got 2 questions actually. Andrew, you probably could answer one, and maybe Scottish people can answer the other one. Just to let you know, this is kind of my first kind of big event for Godly Play, so I'm getting to grips with it. My job's just I've just got promoted essentially to be Youth and Children's Coordinator, and I've only experienced Godly Play a couple of times. Our church context has been a very middle class background. In the last 4 months, our church has become quite multilingual. We've got families from Germany, Ukraine, families from Ukraine who both speak Ukrainian and Russian. We've got Latvian families. How easy is it, do you find, to make Godly Play multicultural in that kind of context? Like, because it's quite, it's very good. I'm not saying that, but it can be quite, you can put it like quite into one culture, but how easy is it to make it multicultural, to reach the whole spectrum of kids? And we also have a kind of family as well. Our minister's family is from Cameroon as well, so it's quite a multicultural church. So I'm just trying to help our church to kind of reach for everyone, is my first question.
Right. Well, first of all, there's an issue of language. And we have numerous examples where the only way to deal with that issue is to translate the stories. And we have lots of that. Godly Play has now been translated into dozens of languages and published in many languages as well. So if you can access that, Alex could help you access that if that works. The other thing about Godly Play that I think works well in a multicultural circle, even multilingual circle, is that you can tell a Godly Play story without words. And Jerome has actually said that, numerous times, written about it. We have criteria that we call, but there are stories that are stories in the style of Godly Play. And I think you're going to experience one of these stories in the style of Godly Play tomorrow. But one of the things one of the criterion for that is that they can be told without words, told and understood without words. So you might even try that. Just doing the movements,
I could add that there are Ukrainian and there are Latvians in this room, so you probably heard that.
Yes, we are multicultural.
Yes,
and
I know. My second question is kind of more for Scottish people. How easy have you found it taking it into your local schools, doing Godly Play? Because we have a great system here in Scotland that we can take Godly Play, we can take our God stuff and teach about God and Christianity in the schools quite regularly. But there's always stuff that you can find out. So I'm just wondering, how easy has it been to take it in to your local schools? Because it's something that kind of...
Should we ask Jersey girl? We have adopted her, so they spoke Scottish.
Yeah, so I tell Godly Play at my children's primary school, and I started off with just my daughter's class, but I'm now doing all of primary 1 to primary 4, their RME once every 6 weeks. It's very easy to bring into the school because it's so open with the wondering, and the children are enjoying the free response time that they can create whatever they want to create. It doesn't have to be pinned on the bulletin board, it's just for them. So it's a really fresh approach to the RME. And it started off with just the one class, and then the teacher talked to another teacher and told them what we were doing. And then as soon as I went in for her class, well, can we get that in our class as well? And it spread really fast around the building. But it's that sort of, it's just the freedom of it all, the space to go and explore the story, take from it what they're going to take from it, and then the wondering continues on throughout the time that I'm not even there. You know, so quite often they'll say, kids are still talking about the flood, want to know more about the ark, you know, and the teacher comes back to me with a response to that. It's lovely. It's just lovely to see the way the children in the schools react to it. So, yeah, highly encourage it in schools. Don't know if there's more to say about it than that.
The curriculum for excellence as well is, and then we'll focus on that. Yeah, okay.
My school experience is in England, so slightly different curriculum, but I had a local school that was very resistant to anything Christian. Prior to me being there, they had a Jewish family who were very, very strict about if it's Christian, our children are going to be extracted, so they were very, very wary. When I took Godly Play, they were thrilled because it was so open.
Yeah.
And I had, the deputy head said to me before I went in on one occasion, I hope you're not going to be too Christian. And I said, well, actually, the story I'm telling today is a story which is across the faiths. And I was actually going to do one of the Old Testament stories. So it was indeed from the three main faiths. And I said, and it's completely up to the children to take their own response from it. And afterwards, she was really pleased with what I had done. Yeah. So I think actually, Godly Play is one of the best things to take into school, because schools don't see you as evangelizing or inculcating the children. They see you as presenting something that the children can think about.
And that's our experience. Outside of pockets like United States and Canada where there is no RE, and I would say that Godly Play is present just as much, if not more so, in schools as in churches. In Germany, for instance, much more Godly Play takes place in schools than in churches. Spain, right now, Godly Play is booming within schools. Roman Catholic schools, albeit, but there's not a tradition within Roman Catholicism doing faith formation of children at home or in the church. They rely on the schools. And now what is becoming the most popular form in Spain is Godly Play. So I only wish, the school where I am is an independent school, which is why you can do it. But state schools, they wouldn't touch it. I wish it were different.
You will find quite a few people in this room who take Godly Play into schools. Probably the most difficult place in Scotland is Edinburgh. Yeah, even North Lanarkshire, you can take Godly Play into schools. Peter and Heather are taking Godly Play into schools as well in the Northern Ireland. This is me squeezing the microphone, I'll stop doing that. We have a schools leaflet which shows how Godly Play fits with the curriculum for excellence. So that's really helpful for your schools to see where that would work as well. And all of these people have probably heard me say this before, but I know you haven't, so I'll say it anyway. When the curriculum for excellence was being written, when the RME module was being written, I was supposed to spend a couple of hours, but it ended up being 10 hours working with the ladies who were writing that, and so it was written for Godly Play. So that should help you. Yeah. Oh, yes, time. Yes. I'll get this back to Michelle.
Thank you very much. I'm just going to pull us all together now because of timing-wise, but thank you very much, Andrew, for sharing everything with us tonight. We've got Andrew with us all day tomorrow as well, so you can chat to him around the teas and the coffees. He's got a workshop, and there'll be another keynote, so this is not the last we'll have seen of Andrew, but thank you very much.
Thank you.